Today we're going to start talking about Bridget Riley, and Bridget Riley is an amazing artist and someone who was groundbreaking, someone who did something that a lot of artists hadn't done quite the same way, and a lot of her stuff is incredibly unique. Um, and there's some interesting things about her. For instance, she worked in what we call op art. We're going to talk a little bit about all this soon, um, where we create optical illusions. But one of the cool things, and we'll talk more about this soon, is that she didn't use tools of any kind. All of this is done by hand. No measuring devices, no measuring tools at all. But she creates these amazing, amazing works of art. Some artists love to trick the eye of their viewer through their work of art. One artistic style that creates an illusion of a third dimension is a two-dimensional artwork called op art. The op in op art is short for optical, or how someone eyes or how they see the world around them, how it affects their eyes. This art movement got its name because the artists created artworks that play tricks on the viewer's eyes. And they're really not just playing tricks on their eyes, they're playing tricks on their mind. We're going to do the attendance answers a little different this week. There's actually going to be 3 attendance answers. So the first answer, you should write this down on a piece of paper. The first answer is going to be op art. The first question is, what style of art creates an illusion? It's a two-dimensional art that creates an illusion in the eye. That's op art. So op art is your first answer for the 3-part attendance question. Let's make sure everybody understands. It's a little different this week. All right. And so when we're looking at op art, again, we're looking at, and she didn't do stuff that no one had ever tried before, but no one ever tried this kind of thing before, really. No one had tried to do it the same way she did. And again, what's remarkable is you look at how the eye, visually, how the circles begin to look different sizes as you look through your peripheral. The ones in front of you look very consistent. But as you move your eye, the ones that are around where you're focusing begin to take shape or movement. It's a lot of optical illusions. It's just a trick on your eye. Bridget Riley is an English artist who's considered one of the leading painters in the op art movement. Born in April 24th, 1931 in Westwood, Norwood, which is a small town close to London. Riley began her career creating illustrations before dedicating all of her time to creating art. So very much like Andy Warhol, who was the pop artist, she starts off as an illustrator like Andy did. She began devoting all of her time though to painting in the 60s. Her black and white op art paintings became extremely popular, and she really became one of the forerunners in this op art movement. Even though they talk about how other artists were maybe the leaders in the movement, honestly, I don't know of any artist who made a bigger impact in the op art movement than Bridget Riley. She now uses color in her artworks too. I love it how they say she now uses them as if she's working today. I think she's 90 if she is still with us. I'd say she just waits for Jeopardy to come on. All right, history of op art. The formation of the op art movement was not the first time artists had created artwork with the intent of tricking the eye of the viewers. In fact, artists have been creating artworks with illusions for many years prior to the op art movement. And so we're going to take a look back in time at what some of those were, going back as far as the Romans uh, and the Greeks. Even Greeks before Romans even used these things we call tessellations. Mathematical geniuses. The Greeks and Romans have figured out tessellations are anytime you create images that fill the entire space. These shapes that have no gaps in between them as they repeat themselves over and over again. And so you can. This one's kind of cool. It creates the illusion of little 3-dimensional boxes or cubes stacked up there. If you ever played Cubert, Cubert bounced around and jumped around on those. It says, "How do you think it would feel walking on a floor covered in these types of tessellations?" And might feel like it would look pointy, maybe. It would look like it might look dangerous. Excuse me. one of the most famous optical illusions discovered in 2009 or created sort of in 2009. And there's different versions that we're going to look at in just a second. Is this thing called the Herman grid? Oh, 1870, excuse me. The illusion is if you look, at any one particular spot, we look at this spot, we can see that there's just a white cross here. But in our peripheral, if you're not the box, if we're not looking at it, we see dark gray squares sort of develop here. We also get the impression, the feeling that these black boxes are on top of the white space instead of the two just existing in that space together. When we look at trompe l'oeil, and we're going to look at another one of those here in just a moment, but when we look at trompe l'oeil was this type of artwork that tried to create the very realistic impression of something. A well-known artistic style that creates the illusion of a third dimension in a two-dimensional space, which is trompe l'oeil. Artists created artworks in this style use perspective to create the illusion of depth in their artworks. In this artwork, the woman appears to be sitting in a room outside the house, yet the artwork is only two-dimensional. And so, there's lots of cool trompe l'oeil stuff, and we're going to look at some different optical illusions that and how the brain kind of creates those illusions or supports or allows those illusions to be interpreted. But trompe l'oeil style painters used to do these in homes, again, because it tries to create that three-dimensional perspective in a two-dimensional space. It really only works from one particular angle in the room. I don't like it that they include pointillism as an optical illusion. It's not really an optical illusion. Eyes blend colors. Yes, that's true. I don't know that that's really as big an illusion as just how our eyes see color. Pointillism is an art technique where artists create many tiny dots of various colors that blend together to create an artwork. It was created by George Seurat, and it was actually used before Seurat, but Seurat made the most use of it. Later used by many other artists trying out that style too. And then they're going to talk real quick about copyright, and it's weird, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Use the work of others. Don't, make your own work. Don't use the work of others. And we're going to talk more about that in just a second. M.C. Escher was one of my heroes. I was a printmaking student for very many years, and he was a printmaker who used these etchings. Etchings are where you draw into a piece of zinc plate or some type of plate, and then you etch it with acid. You put a resist that covers the part you don't want to get etched, and where the acid hits the plate, you can then apply ink, and the ink sticks to it, and then you press paper against it, and that ink prints to the paper. And so you get these cool, really neat drawing-like looks, but because it's a print, he can get thousands of them from that plate. He can print that over and over and over again. But E.C. Escher is famous for his optical illusions. And again, we talked about how BridgetRiley didn't invent the concept. She did it differently than other people had. But other people have been trying to do it as well. M.C. Escher was one of the big ones. So if you look at it, what do you see? Of course, you see this is like a town or village, and it's almost like the town is bending and warping. The same here. It looks like this hallway is bending and warping, and it's sort of this weird, awkward space. We're looking at another version of that Herman grid. This one kind of makes it even more apparent of what's going on in those peripheral. If you look at this white dot, for instance, right now, you probably see these little white dots right here flashing, almost black and white, black to white. That's that optical illusion that's created. That's your brain figuring that stuff out. So how does the brain do that? We're going to stop just a second and take a look. Let me make sure I didn't skip an answer though here. Oh, no, we're good. All right. I want to show you this. How does this work? It works like this.
Inside Science TV.
These are just two identical run-of-the-mill straight lines. Nothing all that terribly interesting about them. But what is interesting is what happens when you change what's going on around them. They'll look like they've changed size in relation to each other. They'll change to different shades. They'll stretch and compress, and can even change directions. Even though it seems like these changes are actually happening on the screen, the only thing that's actually bending and buckling is your mind. What's going on inside your brain is the truly mesmerizing part of visual illusions. When you look at something, what you're really seeing is light, specifically light from the sun, or a light bulb bounces off whatever you're looking at and enters into your eye. The light is then converted to electrical signals that your brain can turn into an image. This process takes about 1/10 of a second, so at any given moment, your eyes are taking in an incredible amount of information. It's really difficult for your brain to try to focus on everything at once, so our brain takes shortcuts, simplifying what we see to help us concentrate on what's important. This trait helped early humans survive encounters with fast predators, or at the very least, avoid running into trees. These shortcuts are also at the heart of how visual illusions fool our brains. Take the herring illusion, for example. Here are two straight lines again, but when you drop them in front of this radial pattern, they looked warped even though they're actually straight. When your brain sees that radial pattern, it focuses on the point in the middle. It looks like you're traveling towards it. Your brain then thinks these parallel lines are getting closer. That's why they seem to get larger as you approach the center of the radial pattern, and that makes the lines look warped. Not all visual illusions trick our brain into seeing motion. Some can also trick our brains into perceiving colors or shades that aren't actually there. Take the mock band illusion. This stack of ascending gray bars seems to be lighter on the bottom, but when we separate them, we can see that they're all a solid color. This is due to an automatic process in our brains called lateral inhibition that helps us define the edges of objects. The effect can be seen in this famous illusion, the Hermann grid, where you can see a sort of gray circle at the intersection points of each square. What about those illusions that make it seem like a still image is moving? The psychedelic peripheral drift illusion is an impressive brain fart. This is a version called the rotating snakes. You can't help but see a very convincing slithering motion within the image, but when you fixate on any point, the motion seems to stop. This is due in part to how we perceive light and dark, and in part to our eye movements. The sequence of light, dark, and colored segments in each of these snakes tricks the motion-sensitive neurons in your brain into responding as they would to real physical motion. The pattern of segments that leads to the illusory rotation is always white, light gray, black, and dark gray in sequence. In color, the lime green acts as light gray, and the light blue acts as dark gray. So you can see it also works in grayscale. Also, blinking, shifting your eyes, and looking away can fuel the illusion of motion. So believe the cliche, what you see isn't always what you get. Speaking of things we're seeing.
All right. I love how it's all very scientific in its explanation, and then he calls it a brain fart when our brains interpret that movement. I don't know that that's the scientific term, but it's what artists try to do. Is they try to trick our brains, um, and by using things that we naturally have developed over time for necessity, for reasons. And so, that artists try to find what's going on and how we can capitalize on how our brain works. And so, we're going to talk on our Make Day about how you will create your own optical illusions, and we'll talk about how the medium and the size and all that good stuff on the Make Day. All right, achromatic and chromatic. And so this is where your second attendance answer of the day is coming in. And you will need to know that chromatic means, colors that have hue. Colors that have hue. And so over time, artist style and process is likely to change. And we've seen this in lots of other artists. From Matisse, who starts off as this crazy fauvist, ends up doing these really neat um, collages. We saw the work transition in Andy Warhol. We've seen all the artists start off one way and they kind of do something else, and that's the same way with Riley. She starts off using only achromatic works of art, and achromatic means black and white. Yeah, it means colors that lack hue, like black, white, gray. And so, for a very long time, that's how she worked. And then she traveled to Egypt in the 1980s, and then after seeing vibrant colors being used there, she begins to incorporate it in her work. So this is sort of post-Egyptian, I mean pre-Egyptian trip and post-Egyptian trip. So before this is how she works and creates this illusion of this movement and depth out into this space here. Using color in this one, though, she creates the illusion of that depth by having these dark lines next to these sort of lighter, brighter lines that seem to recede into space. The darker seem to propel into space, come towards us a little bit. So remember, your second attendance answer of the day, let's go back here real quick, is chromatic. Chromatic is color that has hue. Colors that have hue are called chromatic. That is your second attendance answer of the day. Riley had contemporaries. She didn't work alone. There were other artists who worked with her or during that same time period. People who were in that genre working competitively, if you will. When they would have a show of artists, it wouldn't be just her, it would be lots of other people, including Victor Vasarely, who was considered the leader of the op art movement. He's an Hungarian French artist. Until they told us in this slide here that he was the leader of the op art movement, I would have never honestly guessed that he was the leader of that movement. In this artwork, many geometric shapes like squares, rectangles, and circles repeat. He used simple color scheme to create unity in his artwork, and I think it's obvious that what he's doing is very different than what Riley was doing, but I certainly wouldn't judge hers as any less successful. That's for certain. Wen Ying Sai was an American artist during that pop art movement. Created artwork using color, shape, these contrasting colors, these complementary sort of colors. I mean, I know red is technically the complement of green, but we see this is sort of a red orange, so they sort of have that complementary color, that back and forth creates this tension. You almost get the impression of shadow as they approach each other. I am not going to pronounce his name. Good luck with that one. Aniskowitz. Aniskowitz. I never heard of Richard Aniskowitz. Aniskowitz, I'm going to go, or Alziskowitz. Richard Alziskowitz. I have no idea. American artist who used a technique called overlapping. Now, overlapping is something I'm very familiar with. And artists have used this technique for centuries to create the illusion of things coming over. A lot of graphic artists use interlocking letters that do this sort of thing that kind of create the impression that one thing goes under another. And those are just a couple, few different ways that other artists used op art and created op art and were working at that same time. The op art movement, though, influenced more than just other artists and to create in this genre and work in this genre and incorporate it, but it also extended into other different um, artistic expression, particularly in fashion, even furniture design, in all spaces. Interior design, the cars had interiors that had op art movement stuff going on. It was often influenced by pop culture, that pop art, which is similar again, and so they had that sort of very close relationship. Op art and pop art sort of went hand in hand a little bit. As the pop art movement, I mean, as the op art movement, excuse me, gained popularity in the 1960s, it spread into the fashion industry, and you could sit to see these lines and creating these illusions, starting to with your eye, these optical illusions, sort of making their way into the works of art, or into the clothing. It looks like the works of art were actually part of the clothing. Well, I mean, there's another one. I think another example here I want to show you. I don't know if you all watch. There's a show called The Big Bang Theory, and Sheldon dresses as oh, I forget what he dresses as. It's Op art eventually spread into the toy industry too. Dolls and figurines were often produced and sold wearing brightly colored geometric patterns. These patterns were created by overlapping lines of color. And we see some of that L over under L sort of passing through each other, like we saw in the unpronounceable gentleman's artwork. What similarities do you spot between the patterns in this doll's clothing and some of the optical art we just talked about? Yep, that overlapping is part of it. There's one other one here we want to take a look at real quick. Oh, I love this little car. It's kind of neat. Eventually, the characteristics of op art spread into the automobile industries. Cars sold around the world were painted using geometric shapes and patterns to create the illusion of a three-dimensional surface. Can't stop looking, and this is sort of one of the ones I've seen in person as or a very similar one. I think she had several sort of in this vein, in this style. But it's mesmerizing. You sit and can look at it for a long while. And they're going to talk a little bit about that process that she used and how she worked. And it's not what you would expect. You know, you would expect someone who's working with this kind of type of precision, excuse me, would be using all type of precision developing tools like rulers and tape and masking things and French curves and compasses and protractors and all that sort of thing. Every artist has their own way of creating artworks that are unique to them. Learning about an artist's process often helps the viewer understand the work. And when we look at her work, we're going to look at how she used or how she created artwork, these types of work, without using those types of tools. Throughout her career, she did paintings that are very large in scale that would take months, if not years, sometimes. She started making these small color studies in gouache, and gouache is an opaque watercolor. I'm going to pronounce it for you. You don't need that. Gouache. Gouache. And so when we think about watercolors, very often we think about how thin they are. And if you draw a pencil line over it and you take a watercolor over it, you'll see that pencil line through. Well, gouache is very much like acrylic paint in that it's opaque. But it's like watercolor in that you can add water to it and it comes right back and you can remove it if you like. So a lot of designers began working with gouache. Had she not started as an illustrator, she never would have likely used gouache. Gouache is almost exclusively used by illustrators and designers in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It rarely has much use for artists since the mid 90s at the latest. To complete his color study, Riley mixes all her paint colors by hand and records how she mixes each one. As you can imagine, as reflected sort of in her paintings that again are not made using tools. She's a very right-brained sort of artist, um, or left-brained, I should say, where she's thinking about those analytical things, the mixing the paint, remember the measurements, and she's got that creativity going, but also that very complex, organized mind going. Keeping colors constant is very important at the end result of artwork. If she runs out of one color, she needs to be able to know how to make that again exactly. Once she creates these full life-size gouache and they're ready to go, paint she uses acrylic paints and goes over those. So again, the difference really between the acrylic paint, whoops, I don't know why I hit that, between the acrylic paint and the um, a gouache is that the gouache is, oh goodness, this is my back. The gouache, again, like watercolor, is water soluble. You can add water to it and bring it back. The acrylic that she lays over it, however, is not water soluble. It's permanent. And so no matter what you lay over it, it doesn't go away. So she's now created she really, this is her third layer. She has her drawing, that's her first layer. She has her gouache, her second layer. Now she applies acrylic paint for her third layer. And then once she has that third layer, the way she wants it, she adds oil paint. And again, they're talking about how she never uses rulers, masking tape, mechanical measuring tools, the things that you would assume anyone making all these perfectly spaced things with perfectly circular things would have to be using some type of tool. As you can probably imagine, painting such an exact line and shape is quite a challenging task. Riley has worked with assistants since the early 1960s to ensure her lines and shapes are exactly how she envisions them. She also needs her assistants' help to create those large artworks. Did I miss? No. Oh, not there yet. Okay, we're almost there. There's still one more attendance question to answer. I don't want you to miss it. Copyright. Talking about copyright, and one of the reasons we talk about is when you all are going to create, particularly op artists create, because op art is such a sort of narrow genre of art. It's not you don't have as large a group of people working in it. Very often, what we see is some repeated ideas, and like we saw those different grids, and how if you just make those grids, it's kind of neat, but you're not creating original art. So we want to talk a little bit about what's copyrighted, what you can do, sort of what you can't do, that sort of thing. And so if an artwork is copyrighted, only the original artist can use that work. Only they can make copies of it, only they can distribute it, only they can perform that work publicly or display it publicly, and only they can make changes to that work. However, there's a lot of stuff that artists do and think about doing that's just not protected. Ideas and process aren't protected. So if you haven't actually done it, you're just thinking about it, that thought is not protected. Works that are created and performed without preparing them first, those instant performance pieces, are not copyrighted. Common knowledge, things that everybody knows or should know, the days, the weeks, the date, the names of the months, those types of things. Common knowledge things, those things are not protected. So the last attendance question answer of the day is Piet Mondrian. And what Mondrian did was create these very graphic and rigid works of art, also not using any type of tools, just like BridgetRiley. Much like Piet Mondrian, she worked without the rulers and tools and so forth. And so, um, when you look at how she worked, of course, later than he did, and when we look at how her work sort of resembles stylistically, sort of what he was creating, even if the purpose wasn't the same. He wasn't trying to create optical illusions necessarily here. He was looking at how the eye looks at line and creates movement with line, that sort of thing. But I don't know if optical illusion was what he had intended here, but we do see that the way the lines are created, it sort of makes that play forward and back. It sort of looks like that grid, that Ermine grid we saw. But um, this is his style of art, and he's working without those tools. So some would say by simply working from those same type of tools, she's in fact copying his style, and she is, and that's not just because she's copying the method of his work and the method that he works in. That's also not something he can copyright, and she's free to do that. So we are going to talk more about making these on our make day. Bridget Riley is the artist we've studied. Please know the three attendance question answers are. Get ready to write these down if you haven't already. The first is op art. 2D art that creates an illusion is called op art. The second is color that has hue is called chromatic. Chroma meaning color. Chromatic, color that has hue. And last but not least, remember that Dutch painter, that Dutch artist, Piet Mondrian. He's the artist who also did not work with tools like Bridget Riley. Guys, I hope you got everything you needed. I look forward to seeing the make day where we're going to make optical illusions. Have a great day.